I mean, my commute is about 50 minutes, but it's great because I get a chance to just sit on the train and just work out stuff. Because actually most of my blog posts were written, on the subway.
Nice.
At least the first draft, just on my phone, and then it's like, then I would do that over the course of a few years, and then I would compile them, and then get them into a book-worthy shape, and then then I would have a book out. So just from utilizing my time on the subway wisely.
Are most of those in your new book?
Yeah, yeah, yep. Um, and I guess the way that because the new book is called uh, "Be Inspired, Stay Focused," and I basically compiled all of the different essays that fell under similar categories. So I noticed that over the course of 2 to 3 years, I was writing about sort of almost, for the most part, in sort of the categories of, I guess, learning, creativity, and then things that were more business oriented. So that led to the title being "Be Inspired, Stay Focused, Creativity, Learning, and the Business of Music."
Mm-hmm. Well, I've been reading it. I haven't quite finished it yet because I just got it earlier this week, but I'm about 3/4 of the way through. I've really enjoyed it so far.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And you originally are from Virginia, yes?
Yes, Hampton. And I guess during that time, there weren't a lot of like clubs around, but for some reason, seemed to be several musicians who were very serious about their music. It's kind of like a little bizarre that you had this little hub sort of in a place where there really wasn't a lot of support for the arts in the way that you think that it would be. I mean, I guess there was support in that, at least during that time, all of the, at least all of the public schools, I guess, at least from junior high to high school, had music programs. So it wasn't this thing that was for specialized performing arts high schools, certainly the way they are, what you would find in New York or maybe some other cities, larger cities. So I mean, just a regular junior high or high school would have a stage band, a concert band, and a marching band. So you had, plenty of opportunities to sort of nurture your musical interest.
Could you talk a little bit more about your history with music? I guess starting as far back as you'd like to start, and I'm just curious to know how the journey has evolved, and especially like how your approach to music making and specifically improvisation has changed over time.
Well, I guess there are really two different. Hold on one sec. Sorry. I mean, it's almost like there are two different conversations, because there's the conversation about me, being introduced to music, or maybe more specifically jazz, and that started when I was in junior high school. And I mentioned, all of the schools had stage bands, and basically stage band is a jazz band. So I just remember I was in the 7th grade, and I had only been exposed to sort of like concert bands. So you're just sort of playing what's on the page. And I just remember we had a concert, and I remember there were some 8th and 9th graders who seemed like old people, certainly back then. And I remember during the concert, at some point they all sort of stood up and played these, what I thought were just the coolest sound. And I remember talking to them afterwards, man, what was that stuff you were playing? Oh, this was just, I just made it up. It was my solo. I improvised. And I just thought, man, I want to know how to do that. So I remember talking to the director, and I said, yeah, I want to join the stage band. And from that moment on, I was pretty much hooked. on jazz and improvisation. And I guess and to even talk about the journey, I guess in my effort to learn how to play, or at least my effort to learn how to become a more skilled improviser, that just led to me constantly studying different players, practicing and playing. And it just sort of all sort of happened very organically. And I guess for me, I didn't really have a lot of records growing up. So what I used to do was I would someone had told me to buy a real book. They said, well, if you learn these tunes, you could, develop your repertoire, and then you can go and sit in with people, and then you can, learn how to play. You can get gigs. So they sort of explained to me, this real book was my pathway to employment. And so I didn't really have any records, and certainly this was during the time when you couldn't just type it into YouTube and find any song, anybody you want playing on it. So I used to listen to the radio a lot. So, like the DJ would come on and say, hey, right now we're gonna play a song by a tenor saxophone by the name of Sonny Rollins, and this is called Audio. So then you just kind of grab the real book and then I would record it, and then I would just kind of follow along. And then I would just practice playing with the recording. So I did that, for most of my time throughout high school. And then when I got to college, to Berkeley College of Music, that's when, things really took off. That's when I met a lot of players who were my age, and they had already had extensive record collections. So I thought, man, I really need to up my listening game. So I just started listening a lot. I started buying records. I started recording records. At that time, cassettes were really big. So you would just go. It's really pretty cheap. You can get like maybe for like 99 cents or something. You can get some cassettes. So I would get like maybe have like $10, get 10 cassettes, go to the library at Berkeley and just record a bunch of stuff. And I just kept learning, just kept trying to absorb as much knowledge as I could. But I could keep going. I'm not sure how.
Yeah, keep going.
There are many years to follow. So the Berkeley, that was just one stage. So if I had to break it up, certainly, Berkeley was my stage of just more acquiring knowledge. You're kind of listening, you're practicing, you're just kind of taking it all in. And then it really wasn't until I got to New York that I guess you might say I went to the stage of practicum, where I was taking all of these ideas that I was learning, and I was practice playing them on gigs. And as I've even said in the book, one of the challenges, at least one of my frustrations at the time, was I could not. I didn't have the time to practice as much because I had to work a day job, and I couldn't really practice at my place. So a lot of times, a lot of my practice, happened on the bandstand. So I had to sort of learn how to deal with my knowledge in a different kind of way. Because when I was at Berkeley, I could just practice for 5 or 6 hours a day, and then just kind of rehearse what I was going to play, and then for the most part, I could predict the outcomes. But when I got to New York, I found that I had to develop a more organic style of playing, primarily just because I wasn't able to go to the bandstand being as well rehearsed as I wanted to be. So I had to sort of tap into another aspect of my creativity. And then that's just sort of led to a way of thinking And then when I started, I guess I was in New York for maybe a couple of years before I started playing with Terrence Blanchard's band. And this posed another challenge because when I was at Berkeley, certainly my style was more bebop, hard bop. I was coming out of people. I was playing the tenor saxophone at the time. I was coming out of people like Joe Henderson, Hank Mobley, Dexter Gordon, early Sonny Rollins, early Coltrane. So certainly, my style was certainly chord change based, and even just playing over what maybe one would consider sort of like a cliche jazz language. But when I got with Terrence's group, he had a more modernist approach to improvisation where he hated cliches. They would even make fun of you if you played like a bebop lick. So I had to sort of figure out sort of how to tap into the knowledge that I had accumulated and somehow figure out how to play that language in a way that it felt natural to me, and it sort of rid itself of, I guess, that sort of that cliche sound that he didn't really like. So again, that forced me to have to be even more creative. So there was certainly like this trend that I was following where I'm having to sort of rely more on language that's less on language that's rehearsed and rely more on my conceptual understanding of music. And then played with Terrence for a while. And mind you, I'm giving you all the abridged version. there's a lot of stuff in there. But then after I stopped playing with Terrence's group, I certainly had my moment of, certainly of a contemplative time, because, I really wasn't working a lot at that moment. It was a little bit of weird dynamic that I had with a lot of musicians in New York. I think because I was playing in Terrence's group, and I think there were a lot of people who felt like that I hadn't really paid my dues because my path was not move to New York, play weddings, do a lot of club dates, and play Broadway shows and that type of stuff. I kind of went from Berkeley, and then I certainly had my slow period where I was working a day job to like doing a high profile jazz gig. So there was a lot of people who felt I hadn't really paid my dues. So when his gig ended, I certainly felt there was a little bit of hating going on. So it wasn't like people were sort of welcoming me with open arms, during that time. So I wasn't doing a whole lot. So I remember I had a soprano, and I used to play a little bit, but not much. And then I remember at one point, someone called me for a gig, and the gig paid like $300, and for me, that was a lot of money back then. I mean, keep in mind too, I used to live in this huge house, so my rent at the time was $300. So I didn't really have to make much, in order to pay the bills. So I remember I had this gig that was a soprano heavy gig, and I thought, well, it'll be great. It'll be a great opportunity to get my soprano together. So I remember I worked on it a lot, and I really started to enjoy it. There was a certain clarity that I was able to get to on the soprano that I couldn't get to on the tenor. And it was just very eye-opening at that time because I found that I could play differently. I found that I could play less. I felt like I could play in a way that was a lot more organic. So that sort of led me down that path. But it wasn't all smooth sailing because when I did the gig I thought went horribly because what I discovered about the soprano was it's one thing to be able to play it in the room, but to play it on a gig is just another story. You know, it's another level of command that you need for the instrument because, as you know, the saxophone is already an imperfect instrument. So when you add sort of the small, sort of a conical shape or tubing that the soprano that the air has to move through, you know, the air of margin is very slim, and it's like if we haven't quite mastered that, you know, you know, you know, you're not going to be able to, you know, I think to play certainly with any type of pitch accuracy because, you know, I discovered you kind of have to approach the soprano almost like a type of folk instrument, you know, because you can't, at least during that time, I couldn't just press down the keys and then the note will come out, you know, like I feel it should. It's like there was another level of oral cavity understanding that I had to have in order to play it. So I discovered on that gig that, man, it was one thing to play it in my room or in the practice room, but to play it with a rhythm section. And keep in mind too, when you play the soprano, especially in a sort of a modern jazz context, drummers almost sort of as a default response always go into this kind of cliche, kind of Elvin Jones or Tony Williams. So it becomes very loud. So I found every time I played the soprano, I was just always maxing it out in the higher register, and I never really could enjoy the instrument sort of in the mid and low registers and get a more nuanced sound. So I feel like I'm rambling. I mean, if you want to stop and ask me some other questions.
No, that's all great. It's super interesting. I mean, I did want to ask you about the soprano. I mean, your relationship with it because you are a soprano specialist, and I'm wondering how your relationship with that instrument has evolved as you switched from playing much more straight ahead tenor to, you know, more solo conceptual stuff on the soprano saxophone. Have you moved in that direction because of your relationship with that instrument, or were you able to explore more because of, like you said, playing this instrument, which does feel quite a bit different than the others?
Yeah, I think Jane R. Bloom said it best when she said, when you play the soprano, you have the privilege of being under influenced. You know, so I felt when I was playing the instrument, you know, I didn't necessarily have the legacy of Coltrane and Rollins and Ben Webster and Coleman Hawkins and all of those folks hovering over me. It was, you know, it was kind of an open slate. I felt I was free to sort of tailor it or develop it in a way that I was hearing it. And what I found I had to do was I had to create my own platform, and that's when I formed my group, Global Unity, which, as I defined it, as being a cross-cultural jazz group that sort of that used jazz more as a influence, but it embraced concept of improvisation. Because I guess what was in a global context, because what was unique about the group was, you know, all of these players were jazz players who played other kinds of instruments, or at least non-jazz instruments, and they brought a different type of improvisation. You know, like I had an oud player by the name of Amos Hoffman, who was a jazz guitarist, but he also played the oud. You know, so he would bring that language, you know, to, let's say, a modal tune. And then I would have Gilad, you know, who started off as a jazz vibraphonist, you know, who switched to like the doumbek and all types of other hand percussion. Um, I used to perform with Elizabeth Compton Manu, who was a vocalist, but she was, you know, she was into opera. She did a lot of experimental stuff. She was very much into world music sound. She was into tube and throat singing. So I was, you know, intermingling musically with all of these people, and I was getting all of these different influences from them. So they got me thinking in a way of where I thought about improvisation, not so much as jazz improvisation, but just as just a form of human expression. And then when I saw it in those broader terms, that's when it really opened the doors for me being influenced by, you know, experimental sounds, world music sounds. And then I never, at least for a good deal of time, I never really neglected my jazz roots. So I sort of bring that full gamut, to the table when I do improvise. And I guess as far as going into solo saxophone, you know, I mentioned earlier that one of the frustrations that I had when I first started was that it was very difficult to have a nuanced relationship with the instrument while performing. Because as I said, I was always just trying to cut over rhythm sections. So I found when I was playing solo, I could play pianissimo, I could play fortissimo, and I could play a lot of the extended techniques that I was working on and have them be able to come across with a certain clarity. Because and I guess you probably know when you're playing multiphonics, there's it's all about sort of threading the air through the horns. Like there's a finesse uh, through which you have to blow the horn, and you can't just blurt it out, as though you're trying to cut over a drummer that's bass. So I couldn't really. So when I played solo, I found I could deal with soprano, and as I keep saying this, in a very nuanced way. So that was very attractive because I felt like the soprano is such a beautiful instrument that, but oftentimes when we hear it, we're always maxing it out sound wise, so we're not really getting to hear all of the subtleties of the sound.
When you formed Global Unity, was had you met those specific musicians and you wanted to form the group because you had met them, or did you have this concept for that kind of ensemble and then you found the people based on that concept?
Yeah, it was more the latter. As you know, in New York, you can just go out and hear a lot of great players. So as I said, I was not working a lot. It was bizarre. I don't even know how I made a living. I mean, it was just sort of just kind of luck. Every now and then I would get a nice paying gig, and I would save my money. But I did a lot of hanging out. And I used to live in a house with a lot of musicians, and so I was always having sessions. So I would hear people, oh man, that's a cool sound. I think I want to incorporate that into my group. I could always thought of myself as being like this painter, who paints with sounds and textures instead of colors and shapes. So I would sort of hear this sound. Oh man, I want to add that to my musical picture. Or I would hear this sound over here and think, oh, if I kind of mix this, I can get this hybrid. And then it's also great individually. So it really kind of evolved like very organically, just me hearing people live and just thinking this would be a cool sound to have in my group.
Um, I'm really curious to know about the way that you prepare the soprano saxophone. I've heard some really interesting things you've done where um, you're playing just like you said with all these multiphonics and extended techniques on something that's much more straight ahead, like straight no chaser, and then you
Right.
just transition right into the things with the extended tubes and the
Yeah.
preparations on the soprano, which are very interesting. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how you incorporate all of this into your language and how you develop the preparations on the soprano.
Yeah. I guess one of the things that I discovered, when I was playing the soprano was that I felt like the essence of my sound or the essence of my concept was sound, because at the end of the day, what I liked about all of those musicians that I used to play with was they all had a unique sound, so I started to think about music in those terms and not thinking about it so much in terms of ideas, but as I call it, this sort of a sound-centered approach. And I guess when I define that, with a sound-centered approach, it's like you conceptualize the sound, and then the ideas that come out of that are influenced by having brought the sound to fruition. However, with the idea centered approach, it's like you have the idea, and then the sound is just a means to just sort of bring that idea to fruition. So when I started thinking in a more sound centered way, it just opened the doors for me to be able to push the envelope, sonically. And I started seeing people do things with with woodwind instruments on the internet, and it just got me thinking about it. So I remember I saw someone, an alto player, do something with tubes, and it was very different from what I'm doing, but it gave me the idea. So I just basically went to Home Depot and I just did an internet search that's on tubes, and I didn't know plastic tubes. I didn't even really have the diameters measured. I just remembered I kind of looked at my neck and I just kind of did like this, and then I went to the store, the Home Depot, and I found a tube. I was like, oh, I think this. I was like, oh man, this might fit on the neck of my instrument. And I said, well, I'm going to need something to put the the cork in so the mouthpiece can go. So I was looking around and I found something that fit in that. And then I remember thinking, man, I hope this works because I didn't have my mouthpiece. And then I took it home, and then, I tried to play it and didn't work. I was like, oh, well, maybe I need to put something on the one end of the tube to help seal the mouthpiece. And then I did that, and this sound came out. I was like, wow, I was just so blown away. And then from that point on, I started working with my repairman to put sort of, I guess, more official cork, saxophone cork on the end of the tubes. And then from there, just sort of started this whole language that I was able to develop. Because as I would sort of put together these tubes of different lengths, it was changed the sound significantly. Of course, the longer tubes would give me a much lower sound, and then that would enable me to get certain types of overtones. And then the shorter ones would get me, something maybe with a little more clarity. It would be really loud, and then the overtones would be unique, to that particular instrument. So to that particular tube. So it got me thinking about improvisation in a different kind of way too, because with the tubings, um, you can't approach music from a 12 uh, 12 tones of equal temperament perspective. You have to deal with the language that's available within that particular setup that you're playing. So sometimes I would only have at my disposal with certain tube tube horn mouthpiece combination would be like maybe 6 or 7 notes. So I would have to, my improvisation was always sort of informed by what I was able to do. So you're sort of surrendering to what you feel you want to play, and you're just kind of dealing with what you're able to play and sort of being content with that. There's certainly like a zen a zen sort of lesson to be learned from that. Just sort of being in the moment and accepting what's there and being happy with being where you're at that particular time, or in this case, with those particular sounds that I'm able to play.
Like you say in your book, having restrictions can help you be more creative, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I live all of those words. It's just so funny. I remember I'd given the book to a colleague of mine, and he's younger, so he always comes to my office, and we just have conversations. And then I remember he read the book. He was like, "Oh man, this is just like I felt like I was in your office, just talking to you."
Do you still, when you do when you put together the tube instrument, do you still call it a saxophone?
Yeah, I call it a prepared saxophone. So because I guess that's what it is. So when I start about so and that opened up other ideas too. Just like when I started thinking about pre- what prepared saxophone meant. So I defined it as being uh, altering the way air enters and exits the instrument. So then all of my experiments were based on that definition. So that led to me not only using the tubes. I remember I started uh, using a kazoo. I may have a couple of videos where I'm just sort of blowing through a kazoo, and the kazoo has a very certainly distinct sound quality. So I would just sort of deal with that sound, and then there was a noisemaker that I put inside the instrument, and that would give me a very unique sound. So it's all based on just altering the way air enters and exits the instrument.
What are some of the other preparations that you have done, and how does it affect the language that when you take it back to play with other groups, or do you only play your prepared saxophone as a soloist?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, one of the things um, I discovered was that in order for me to play the language that I developed from the prepared saxophone approach with other people, was I had to play with others who also developed their own language that fell outside of that 12 tones of equal temperament concept. So like for example, I did a gig. It was pre-recorded. I think it's going to be aired this Thursday. It's for this organization. You probably know it. It's called the Arts for Arts organization. They're the folks who present the Vision Festival every year. They're certainly one of the you know uh, biggest proponents of, of improvised music and free jazz in New York. So I recorded something for them, and what's unique about it, they'll just kind of call you up and say, "Hey, can you bring in a trio?" And they don't really specify that you do any particular thing. They sort of leave it up to you. So I thought it'd be great, man. Let me just put together a group, a trio of people who are playing their instruments prepared. So it was a trio of this guy, piano player Eli Wallace, who plays the prepared piano, and then in Sandy Ewan, who plays the prepared guitar. And so he's just all, we didn't rehearse, and I knew their sound, and I thought, well, I think, just from us dealing with our own language, in some ways, I think because we are not connected to sort of these preconceived ideas of what our instruments are supposed to sound like, and sort of embracing sort of a new sound that, or the new sounds that come out of it. It seems to work, really well. So I didn't really have to change what I did. It's like everything I played worked perfectly with what they were playing. Whereas like if I was playing with someone playing the traditional piano, playing the piano in the traditional way, then they they're not able to adapt to the language that I'm using because they're dealing with that within the limitations of the piano. So it's a challenge. So I find if I really want to delve into that sound, I have to play with others who are also dealing with their instrument in a similar way. It's almost like it's like if you get a group of people who are outside of the normal realm, it's like the fact that they're outside of the realm sort of unifies. It's interesting. It's almost like you could have people who are sort of sort of radical folks within society, but even though they may not be standing for this, or at least speaking about the same things, but just the fact that they're all thinking outside of the status quo, there's something very unifying that they have. So it's like the same thing musically. The fact that we're not limiting ourselves to this 12 tones of equal temperament way of thinking, that in itself is enough to unify us.
What do you look for in a collaborator aside from, you talk about being very sound oriented and looking for specific sounds for certain projects, but aside from that, are there any other qualities you look for in collaborators?
No, I guess usually collaborators who I guess have their own sound or have their own approach to the instrument, because that inspires me, I guess, to be the best version of myself that I can be. Because sometimes you get with people who, they 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 always want to put everything into I guess, to a conventional box. Because I remember, I remember one time I was playing, a piano player called me up, and he was like, "Yeah, man, I like what you're doing with multiphonic. I had some ideas. So he said, so yeah, can you play that multiphonic?" So I played it. He was like, "Well, can you like hold that note and then do something with this note?" So I could like, it doesn't really work that way. So you have to deal with multiphonics as its own language. Like you can't treat it like if you're playing a 3-note multiphonic, you can't treat it like 3 saxophone players playing 3 different notes and you're sort of moving them around. So sometimes when I'm playing with people who are thinking in a more conventional way, it's like they never deal with it for what it is. They're always trying to make it something that it's not. So when I'm collaborating with people, these are all people who are very comfortable with their sound and are open to, expanding sort of the sonic parameters of their instrument.
Who are some of your current influences?
Current influences. I mean, we talked about collaborators. I I become very influenced by the people that I'm playing, which is an amazing feeling. I mean, I mean to be able to play with people whom you would just go listen to just to learn. It's like you actually get a chance to just listen to them. I don't know. It's like it's hard to describe. It's like sometimes you just have to pinch yourself, and you kind of have to say, you kind of have to get out of your head and get out of this being overly humble way of thinking and just saying, well, they have a voice, I have a voice, and we're just having a conversation. So occasionally I did something recently with Dave Liebman, and that was one of those situations too, where it's like you can kind of go into it like, oh man, that's Dave Liebman. You can kind of sit back and just kind of listen. But then at some point you say, well, I guess I need to play too. you know, so like just playing beside him, you know, was very, you know, it's always a learning experience, you know, just hearing his sound. And it's a learning experience in that it also helps me to appreciate my sound as well. Because I guess the first time I played with Levin, it's like I had always thought about those albums he did with Steve Grossman, like Live at the Lighthouse, where it's just like, you know, just crazy saxophone, altered licks, and all of this. So I was always thought about that. You know, and that sound always sounded very competitive. And so when I first time I played with him, you know, I was just sort of being myself. And then I understood why that he actually liked to play with me, because he heard a sound. You know, he didn't hear someone who was playing just as much shit as he was. You know, he heard a person who had a voice, and so that enabled us to communicate. You know, so but there are other folks. You know, I play a lot with Joe Morris, and even though he's playing the guitar, you know, the fact that he's pushing the sonic boundaries of his instrument just gives me a lot of ideas. You know, like with him, like his style, it's almost like he doesn't put many rest in the music. And sometimes it can feel frustrating because you're just kind of like, sometimes you might want some space, but it actually taught me that instead of thinking, well, maybe he needs to put more space, I need to learn how to sort of go inside of what he did, what he's doing. So when I'm playing with him, I would also play like that. Like I would circle a breathe and just go like 5 minutes, just like playing lines and just sort of having these constant streams of consciousness going the way that he plays. So that opens me up to being able to improvise in a way that I normally wouldn't. And then I perform with Faye Victor, another vocalist who does something unique with her instrument. And again, that encourages me to 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 go deeper and just accept what I do more. You know, because I think that's the big part of it too. I think the biggest challenge, just as far as being a musician, is just sometimes silencing that 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 inner voice of doubt that's saying, no, you can't do this. And sometimes you have to, if you're not able to silence that voice, you you have to surround yourself by people who encourage you to follow your creative instinct. You know, because like I'm not always confident about what I do if I'm just at home. But like if I'm playing with other people who are following a similar path, then you know I'm thinking, okay, I'm on the right path. You know, but I've always been very much influenced by that story. I'm sure you maybe this was maybe you guys weren't taught this the ugly duckling. You know, so I've always thought about the concept of the ugly duckling, and so the you know so the bigger you know the moral is, you know, is really just sort of accepting who you are and don't try to be something that you're not, and to surround yourself by people with a comparable, you know, musical outlook. You know, so that's the sort of the lesson. I always think about the ugly duckling concept, and that always sort of helps me to thrive more as a creative artist, because sometimes it's not just me uh, being in the wrong. It's not me doing something that's incorrect. It's just I'm doing it with the wrong people. So it's just like you just have to find the right people to share your musical ideas with, to collaborate.
I just want to pivot a little bit to your teaching and pedagogy, especially with undergrad students. Are you primarily working with them on traditional jazz playing, or do you dig into free improv and conceptual thinking? I'm just wondering what direction you
Right.
go in, especially after reading a good chunk of your book and just hearing you talk now.
Ironically, I do very little teaching of the saxophone. That, that's probably the most bizarre thing about my career or existence. Like most of what I do is so saxophone centered, but I have very little experience in actually teaching people the saxophone. Usually, at least students, most of the people that I give lessons to are actually professional musicians, because these are people who are sometimes, and a lot of times these will be folks who are coming to New York, or if they get grants, study grants to come to New York, and they'll study with me. And then that would be pretty much me just sort of doing what I do and just sort of teaching them, sort of like my concept and just some of the things that I'm working on. But as far as teaching students sort of conventional or traditional jazz, yeah, I don't really do that. I feel like whenever I get asked to teach a private lesson, I feel like I'm so horrible at it, primarily because I don't do it very often. I just don't have like just like a repertoire of things that I can just pull out of the file and say, oh well, do this for next week, and then, oh yeah, when you finish that, play this. I don't really have that so much. So more, a lot of times when people study with me, it's conceptual, and they're not things that I could give them, say, well, take this to the keys and I'll see you next week. It's like you might give them something and it's like they might need to sit with it for 2 or 3 months or longer. So my as far as my pedagogy, I don't deal with teaching in that way. Most of my teaching at the college is as a lecturer. So I teach music and culture, where I find different styles of music that I'm interested in. Then I, you know, use the class as a platform to learn about those things. Occasionally, I teach music theory, but then it's very, very rudimentary stuff. We're talking like major, minor, diminished triads, major scales. And every now and then uh, I'll go into something very conceptual. I'll lose them, and then I'll bring it back. I'll sneak it in. I'll sneak what I do in just in small increments, but you know, I don't. It's not really what I do, and I think that's why I blog, and that's why I write books. Primarily because I don't have an avenue to actually to share, a lot of the things that I'm actually working on. I think if I like all of these things that I talk about in the book, if I were teaching these things every day, I may not even feel compelled to put it into a book because I'm sort of getting that satisfaction from doing it all the time. So yeah, so it's sort of led me down this very unique path, you know.
What are some of the big conceptual things that you like to impart on the students that you do work with?
You know, like I was I think one time we were talking about like music notation, and I mean we're talking like really rudimentary stuff like whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, eighth notes, and things like that. And I was just basically saying, well, this is just when you think about it, it's just a map. It's a musical map with a set of directions. So I said, well, this is one way that you could do it, but you could have your own set of symbols. You can have your own set of directions. So I might, have them. do something like that. Say, well, come up with a scenario where you want the people to do a certain thing and come up with some symbols and set of direction, and that's your own notation. And as long as the musicians understand what you're trying to convey, and as long as the music that's being realized is what you want to hear, then that's just as valid of anything that is conventional.
When you sit down to practice, do you have a routine that you go through? Do you have a particular practice that you um, work on? Are you always working on your solo preparations, or what does
Yeah.
that look like on a weekly or daily basis?
Yeah, I go back and forth. There's sometimes I feel a need to deal with the instrument in a conventional way. So, I might practice classical etudes, scales, and things of that nature. And then I'll feel a need to nurture more my creative side. So there'll be times where I'll go months without practicing a scale, and I'll just pick up my horn and try out crazy stuff. Like that will be my practice. So it's usually whatever I feel my needs are at the time. But I'm constantly going back and forth. I'm constantly nurturing the fundamentals of the instrument, and then I'm also dealing with things in a very conceptual way. Because the thing about musical concepts, it's like, it's not something that's going to be a linear process. Because I always tell people the story about John Coltrane and Thelonious Monk. Well, the way that John Coltrane discovered multiphonics was he was playing, and Monk was fascinated by the patterns of that the keys were making with the fingers were making with the keys. So at one point he said, well, what would happen if you kept these fingers down and lift this one up? And then he blew through the instrument, and then the multiphonic sounded. So I always explain, well, he could have practiced in a linear way, until the cows came home, and it never would have led to the multiphonics. So a lot of times it's not about putting 1 + 1 together and getting 2. Like sometimes, you have to put 1 plus K, you know, whatever plus question mark. You have to put different combinations together to get different outcomes. Sometimes linear thinking only leads to linear outcomes. If you want a nonlinear outcome, then you have to practice nonlinear thinking.
What are you working on right now or these days? Do you have a big project you're working toward, or like a certain gig, or I don't know, anything big like that? Or is it more on a daily level, certain things you're trying to work out in your practice?
Yeah, I guess as far as any type of big gig, I don't really have anything that I'm preparing for. I mean, I usually it's just really kind of a organic process. It's like I get ideas and then I try them out. Usually I try them out on Instagram. Instagram is great because it's just 60 seconds, and I could, I'll get an idea of, well, let me see what people think about this. So I'll play it, upload it, and I'll see what the response is. And also, it helps me to document the idea. So, maybe a few months down the road, I'll just go through my Instagram account and think, oh, what was that sound I was working on? And I, just sort of listen back. Oh yeah, I think I want to develop that. So it's all sort of organic. It's not really any at any point I just sort of sit down and go, oh, I'm going to develop this. I'm going to develop that. It's sort of I get inspired, I document, and I kind of move on. And then I come back and revisit at at later times if I need to.
Thank you so much for doing this. It was really great to chat with you. And
Cool. All right, take care. Have a good one.
Bye,
great. See
Sam.
you, Sam.
All right, goodbye.